The Jumbo was flight number 103. It had left London Heathrow at 6:25 tonight, bound for John F. Kennedy Airport in New York. There are understood to have been a number of American servicemen who joined the flight from Frankfurt on board.
Mike Braun retired in 2008 as Chief of Operations for the Drug Enforcement Administration. He says Al-Qassar is suspected of working with drug traffickers, terrorists, and rogues around the world. His name has also cropped up in a litany of international scandals. Iran-Contra in the U.S., arms embargo cases in Somalia and Bosnia, a terrorist attack in Argentina.
Now, you've said that if you'd known it was an arms for hostage swap, you would have opposed it. You said the first you knew it was an arms for hostage swap was in December of 1986,
when the
correct?
whole thing became briefed to me by Senator Durenberger.
Exactly.
And the proximity of arms to hostages much closer.
But, Mr. Vice President, you went to Israel in July of 1986,
yes,
and a member of your own staff, Mr. Craig Fuller, has verified, and so did the only other man there, Mr. Nir, Mr. Amaron Nir, who's the Israelis' top anti-terrorist man.
Yes.
Those two men were in a meeting with you, and Mr. Nir not once but three times underscored with you that this was a straight-out arms for hostage swap.
What they were doing.
Now, how do you reconcile
what they were doing?
How can you reconcile that you were there, Mr. Nir, underscored three separate occasions that it was an arms for hostage swap and told you were dealing with the most radical elements in Iran? You were dealing straight away with the Ayatollah Khomeini.
I was told what they were doing and not what we were doing.
BCCI, it's a shadowy international bank linked to terrorists, drug runners, and dictators. The bank is closed now, but it had operated in some 62 countries, and its legacy is shaking world capitals. The bank's shady dealings were first exposed on this program almost 3 years ago by the investigative team of Brian Ross and producer Ira Silverman. Brian is with us now from Atlanta. Brian, how can one bank cause so much trouble in so many countries?
Well, Faith, the collapse of BCCI has confirmed what many investigators suspected for several years, that this bank was, without a doubt, the world's dirtiest bank, and that wherever it went, its way of doing business was corruption, deceit, and fraud. Now, with almost $5 billion missing, the BCCI scandal is sending financial and political shockwaves around the world. In London today, the BCCI scandal created a crisis in Parliament for Prime Minister John Major, who in his previous post as Britain's chief financial officer allegedly ignored early warnings about BCCI. Little was known about BCCI until 6 of its top officers were arrested in Tampa in October of 1988 on charges of laundering drug money for Colombian cocaine bosses. The BCCI men were convicted, and the bank itself pleaded guilty. But for some reason, the bank was allowed to continue to operate all over the world, and investigators say U.S. prosecutors failed to follow up on evidence of widespread corruption and other crimes that this month finally led to the bank being shut down.
There are indications that some of the reluctance to prosecute this bank stem from the favors it did. The favors it did for intelligence services everywhere.
Jack Blum investigated BCCI for a Senate subcommittee and told producer Ira Silverman there is evidence that the CIA and other intelligence services used the bank in covert operations.
Too many secrets of too many countries, too many prominent people, too many hands-on, and that makes it desirable that this entire affair be forgotten by people in public life. The problem is it can't be forgotten because it's too important if we're to maintain democratic institutions.
Now, the key piece of evidence, one of the few that was tangible, was a tiny fragment found some 3 weeks after the event in a field 35 miles east of here. For months, it remained unnoticed and unremarked. But eventually, that fragment was to shape the entire investigation. The fragment, 4 millimeters square, was said to be part of a timer circuit board that could have triggered the bomb. It was found embedded in charred clothing. The clothing bore the label, "Made in Malta." So the focus turned to Malta and the question who'd bought the clothes. The shopkeeper identified McGrahy only years later after seeing him pictured in a magazine as a suspect.
The evidence was extremely weak. There were areas of it that were challenged at the trial, but those challenges did not seem to impress the judges.
Robert Black's one of Scotland's most eminent QCs. He persuaded the Libyans they get justice from Scottish judges in neutral Holland. Now he has serious doubts about the conviction. There's the supposed plot, an unaccompanied suitcase with the bomb inside, being put on a plane at Malta airport, transferred to another flight in Frankfurt, and transferred again in London. Black says it defies logic.
All of the evidence from Malta was to the effect that there was no such piece of unaccompanied baggage. And indeed, the judges themselves accept that. There is no evidence from Malta.
Here in America, there's long been frustration at having to bow to Scottish jurisdiction over Lockerbie. But while they couldn't try the case, the Americans didn't exactly stand idly by during the investigation. The CIA was always active and influential, and at the FBI, they claim to have made the vital link between Libya and the bomb which blew up the plane.
Abdul-Majid Jaka was a Libyan informer who had been recruited by the CIA. He knew the two men in the dock and could apparently pin the charge on them.
There was this great celebration that we have the smoking gun, and it was the Libyans. And so, and everybody was convinced that this was going to hold up in court.
Michael Scharf first heard of Jaka when he was an attorney at the State Department. At the time, he was drafting the case to go before the UN Security Council for sanctions against Libya. Scharf was tipped off about a secret CIA informer in the heart of the plot to blow up Pan Am. This informer was being paid $1,000 a month, rising to $1,500, to meet his CIA handlers in a Malta safe house. Langley even paid for a sham operation on his arm so he could avoid military service back home in Libya.
We believe Jaka is becoming desperate and is certainly milking all of his contacts, including us, for whatever he can get.
My moment was like, wow, they didn't tell us anything like that. The CIA knew all along that this guy was a liar, that this guy was just out for money, that they didn't believe half of what he said, if any of what he said, and yet they were presenting him as the star witness in a case that is of such importance. So for me, that was really an eye-opening moment, a shocking moment.
When Jaka took the stand behind a screen to protect his identity, he described how he had seen al-Megrahi and Fahima at Lucca Airport with a brown suitcase. Apparently, Jaka had first recalled this handy lead 3 years after the event, and after the CIA had whisked him away from Malta in a speedboat, given him and his wife a new identity and a new life in America under a witness protection program.
If the provenance and history of that fragment remain murky, we found evidence which raises fundamental doubts. Could that fragment really have been used to trigger the Lockerbie bomb?
It's the actual make and model that the fragments were found of.
John Wyatt is the UN's European consultant on explosives.
Right at the bottom, we've actually got the
He's
radio.
recreated the suitcase bomb, which it said destroyed Pan Am 103. He's meticulous. The clothes, before they were charred, are the same. And so's the radio, where the explosive and the timer circuit board were supposedly placed.
I must admit, with the quantity of explosive we were using, only sort of 300-400 grams, I thought there were going to be some remnants of the radio left, but it just totally disintegrated. I mean, really went into tiny, tiny bits.
He first tested the radio. He blew it up and captured what was left. With the radio disintegrated, the timer and its circuit board were obliterated. He built up the tests, finally loading the suitcase, radio inside, into an airline container. The result was the same. Nothing remained. When you now hear forensic experts say, look, we found this piece of a circuit board, this is the key piece of evidence. What do you think of that now?
I find it quite extraordinary. Obviously, these things are not impossible. We only carried out 20 tests. We didn't carry out 100 or 1,000 tests. But in every of those 20 tests, we found absolutely no sign at all. So I find it highly improbable that you would find anything like that. I mean, particularly when this occurred at 30,000 feet, and now those fragments are dropping into, long wet grass over hundreds of miles.
Critics of the Lockerbie trial say the fragment was never properly tested and could well have nothing to do with the bomb. Yet without the fragment, the rest of the evidence on Libya, Malta and Megrahi falls apart.
Abdel Bassat al-Megrahi, the man convicted of bombing Pan Am Flight 103 out of the skies over Lockerbie, returned to Libya a free man last week. The Scottish government released the terminally ill terrorist, saying the decision was based purely on compassionate grounds. But the United States believes that other motives were involved. Well, let's now cross to our Washington studio and Alyona Minkowski to find out more. Alyona, over to you.
Thanks, Alice. Well, that's right. This story could be based on a little more than just compassion. It could be based on some very lucrative financial deals that were cut between the Libyan government and British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, as well as some other high-level officials. It could also be an attempt by the British government to save face. Allegedly, some evidence was about to come out that would have proven that the Lockerbie bomber was innocent all along. So as the story gets more complicated, we really have to wonder how much of these allegations are true, or could they be coming out of some negative emotional response here in the U.S. too? Now, here to discuss it with me is RT contributor Wayne Madsen. Wayne, thanks for joining me today. So first, can you tell me, where does the evidence come from that would say that this was based on a financial deal?
Well, my sources that are very close to the British government are telling me that a year ago, negotiations began between Colonel Gaddafi's government and the British government to help bail out the largest Scottish banks, Halifax Bank of Scotland and the Royal Bank of Scotland, which assumed some toxic assets. They had loans that turned out to be very bad loans. The deal was basically, to sum it up, bailout for Megrahi, the Libyan convicted accused bomber of the Pan Am 103. So 2 weeks prior to Megrahi's release, a meeting between Saif el-Gaddafi, Colonel Gaddafi's son, and Peter Mandelson, the British business secretary, in a Rothschild-owned estate on the island of Corfu. That's apparently where the deal was consummated. They decided to release Megrahi on compassionate grounds because he's said to be suffering from prostate cancer. Recent reports from Tripoli now are saying that maybe his cancer isn't that far advanced, that he has plans to write a tell-all book about his experiences.